Hello, this is Glasgow Loves You, and my name is Jenny. And this evening we're going to be interviewing Professor John Barry. So, Professor John Barry is Professor of Green Political Economy at Queen's University Belfast. He completed his PhD right here at Glasgow University. His areas of interest include green political theory, political economy of sustainability, citizenship, democracy, and green politics, civil republicanism, and green political theory and interdisciplinary sustainability research. So in 2003, he was elected as joint leader of the Green Party in Northern Ireland, and he stayed joint leader until 2009. So it's just John, if you want to say hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome.
And this evening we've got Paul, who's helping on the social media side of things. Do you want to say hello? Okay, we've got Paul there as well.
Hello. Sorry, muted.
Okay, no worries. So we'll just get started then. So Northern Ireland then voted to remain by large majority, and Northern Ireland lived through an internal conflict for 30 years and has experienced peace for only 20 years. And being part of Europe helped to resolve that conflict. Do you think that anyone in the UK really understood the complexity and delicate nature of the peace in Northern Ireland when they voted?
Absolutely not. I mean, Northern Ireland was a remainder, an issue that wasn't really prominent in the whole referendum. And indeed, there is some survey evidence that hard Brexiteers were willing to risk violence returning to Northern Ireland if that was the price to be paid for a hard Brexit. So again, as many of you will be aware, it was England that took the UK out of Europe, and certainly there was a strong ignorance around Northern Ireland, as there always has been in England and other parts of the UK, you could say for justifiable reasons. But I don't think even the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, which was the only major party in Northern Ireland to vote for supporting Brexit, I don't think they really thought it was going to win. Because actually what's happened now is that the DUP is a staunchly unionist party that wants to maintain the link between Northern Ireland and the UK. But actually the issue of Brexit, and I know it's one of the questions that will come up later on as well, has probably made a united Ireland more possible than ever before. And in other words, here we have the ultimate historic irony of a staunchly unionist party having created the conditions which may actually eventually lead to a referendum on the abolition of the border and potentially creation of a reunified Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in terms of then the Good Friday Agreement, so Monica McWilliams, who was in the Women's Coalition and who helped draft the Good Friday Agreement, she said that those constitutional issues were supposed to be resolved. And she said that she wrote European into the Good Friday Agreement. So how important do you think like the EU is to the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, there are two levels of this. One is that we shouldn't get too concerned that somehow that the peace process is going to collapse and there's going to be an imminent return to violence because of the exit of the UK and Northern Ireland from Europe. The ultimate guarantors of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, folks need to understand, but Glaswegians and people from Scotland would know this because of the sectarian nature of our politics, that if you tend to be a Catholic and nationalist, you call it the Good Friday Agreement, given Good Friday in Catholic religion. And if you're Unionist or Protestant, you call it the Belfast Agreement.
Yeah.
But they both refer to the same thing, the 1998 Peace Accord. But the two guarantors of that are not the EU, it's the British and Irish governments. But there's no doubt about it that the membership of both of these nations at the time of the European Union did help. Certainly the European Union has transferred and invested millions in peace monies in Northern Ireland and many good cross-community work and so on. So while I think it certainly is regrettable that EU funding will be missing. And it's also going to be regrettable that Britain and Ireland will not be able to use the European Union membership as a way of meeting to discuss issues of joint concern. please don't go away from the night thinking that Northern Ireland is on the precipice of a return to violence simply because of Brexit. It certainly made things more difficult. Yeah. It's certainly given a lease of life to Irish Republicans and Irish nationalists who are basically claiming that the solution to Brexit for Northern Ireland is a united Ireland, which I'm quite doubtful of, because I can see how that could lead to violence. If Irish Republicans are pushing a border poll or are making claims, some which are exaggerated, that somehow the reappearance of border posts in Ireland is suddenly going to mean that we return to violence. I'm certainly not underestimating that. But for me, the real threat now is not necessarily from the UK leaving the European Union as a prelude to perhaps violence or increased political instability. It's how Irish Republicans may press home what they see now as an advantage in terms of their pursuit of a united Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. So do you think that whether there's a deal or not, that would have an influence on whether there would ever be a referendum on United Ireland?
Well, there is no doubt about it that the Brexit has started a process which, in a way, has fast forwarded something that was inevitable anyway. I mean, it's part of the protocols of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that and it's a bizarre protocol. It basically states that if the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland thinks there's a majority for a united Ireland, we call a poll. And if you think about it, it's absolutely mad. In other words, you have to predict the outcome before you call a poll, as opposed to having, a vote and then seeing which way people will vote. But there's no doubt about it, across Ireland, and it's not just Sinn Féin, although they've been quite prominent in this, other parties, even in the Republic of Ireland, who would be less staunchly Republican, are now credibly talking about, sometimes it's called a united Ireland, sometimes it's called a shared island, or a shared island, or a shared Ireland, and so on. And it all revolves with the same issue, that the border has now become animated again in a way that it hadn't been since the Good Friday Agreement. And so for me, I can see, I can't put a time on it, but I can see in a couple of years ahead, not least because of the population increase of the Catholic nationalist community in Northern Ireland, that it's not quite a parity. There is still a majority of Protestant Unionists, that there is an inexorable kind of momentum building for a border poll. But before I end that, we mustn't think that just because you're a Catholic nationalist, you're going to be pro-United Ireland, or just because you're a Protestant Unionist. You probably would be, but we mustn't, break down people's political allegiances into their, religious background either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's obviously like a very, complicated situation there in terms of allegiances as well, particularly with a lot of, because obviously I lived in Belfast for 6 years, and I've met a few people who would be kind of the loyalist unionist persuasion, but now they're also applying for Irish passports because they kind of, they want to just kind of hedge their bets in some ways. Have you met anybody like that?
Oh, yes. I mean, as well as being a former leader of the Green Party, I was 7 years a local councillor here from 2011 to 2018. So right at the moment of the 2016 referendum. And within weeks of the result coming out, my hand was worn off me with signing passports. Some of whom were from prominent local unionist politicians that I knew. And for them, it was partly, this does not mean to say that they believed in a united Ireland, but they said, why should the rights that go with my EU membership be taken from me, when at the very least, unlike Wales, England and Scotland, people in Northern Ireland, they can have a British and Irish or Irish passport and declare their national identity as Irish, British or both. So there's been a massive increase in the number of unionists who now have both British and Irish passports. And some of them do this on pragmatic grounds. They say, well, if you're traveling to dodgy parts of the world, you're better off having an Irish passport than having a British one. But there was also this issue that for some of them, they felt that they were being robbed of their EU entitlements as citizens. And this was one way they could maintain them. So don't think that just because some unionists now have Irish passports, that means they would vote for United Ireland. It's much more pragmatic than that.
Right. Yeah. And so in the general public, how do they feel about kind of no deal? Like, or do you think they're like divided along sectarian lines completely, or is it's a lot more complicated?
It wasn't completely along sectarian lines, but it largely was. For example, of all the constituencies in Northern Ireland, those that were nationalist constituencies voted to remain, and those which were Protestant Unionist constituencies voted to leave, with the honourable exception of the constituency I live in and you used to live in, Jenny, North Down. So we'll call that the Barry effect, that our very, very modest campaign to remain worked here in North Down. I think it's largely to do with the class composition of this constituency. It's an educated, professional, middle class, and we know that, again, not completely, they tended to vote for Remain. But sadly, like a lot of things in Northern Ireland, this did come down in part to a sectarian division. So the most hard Brexiteers were on the unionist side, particularly the DUP. Sinn Féin, to be honest with you, as the most prominent Irish Republican Party, it had a very lackluster campaign. And it has to be, admitted, myself included, I spoke on behalf of the Green Party at the Remain, Stronger In campaign we had here. And we weren't really on the ball. And I think, you probably had discussions about this, and I know it's a bit boring and so on, but I do think the Remain campaign was crap in terms of the referendum. It didn't have the passion, it didn't have the narrative that, Take Back Control did. Despite the lies and so on, and some, deep soul searching took place, certainly for me and others, that we didn't think was going to happen. So therefore, we didn't really campaign very strongly. We kind of said, well, the assumption would be that the UK is going to stay in. But again, that may be controversial to say, and it might be something that nobody wants to listen. My own view as a long-time political activist, again, is that the Remain campaign was crap. It really just wasn't up to what was needed, particularly around the attachment of a strong narrative. Now, it is difficult. It's much more difficult to defend the status quo, as Remain did, as opposed to being a doughty outsider and so on. But certainly I'm just being fully open and honest with you in terms of, we had a very, very lackluster Remain campaign in Northern Ireland, even though, of course, as I said, we did vote to Remain, as did Scotland. But I think it was not because of the campaign that we ran, which was very, very weak.
Well, yeah, no, I think a lot of people were taken by surprise, including Boris Johnson. I don't think he expected it at all. So you wouldn't be the only ones. So just wondering, so in terms of like EU rights, and that, with, say, one group of people in Northern Ireland, they will have all the EU rights, and then another group, say, who identify as British, they'll have their EU rights taken off them. So how do you think that the courts will be able to function, like, say, in terms of human rights, or like if one group can appeal to Europe and then the other group can't, like, do you think that's going to create difficulties?
Oh, absolutely. And again, as a Democrat, I have to, acknowledge people can use whatever non-violent democratic means they can to get their views, promoted and so on. So I can see there's going to be lots of recourse to the courts, to the law, arguments that, well, does the European Court of Justice apply to Northern Ireland? To what extent are citizens who are Irish and have Irish passports and therefore are also EU citizens, will they get preferential treatment or less good treatment than citizens in Northern Ireland who don't have this? So I honestly don't know how it's going to work out. I just have a sense that it is going to be a disaster in terms of trying to figure out, on top of it all, and already, it's wrong to think that Northern Ireland is at peace. We still have a lot of, particularly in working class areas, paramilitaries are still dominating and exercising coercive control over communities. So we don't have a peace. Yes, the large-scale violence and bombing, certainly bombings in mainland Britain and so on in Europe, that's ended. but there isn't. We have a very unsettled peace here. And what's added then fuel to the fire is, of course, what's happening now with Brexit, what's also now happening with Irish Republicans pushing forward for a United Ireland, people dimly on the unionist side beginning to see that the DUP made a monumental error in supporting Brexit, because now what it's led to is that when Boris Johnson said over his dead body to be no customs border down the Irish Sea, well, guess what? That's what's going to happen. On the upside, and this has less been prominent, certainly in media discussions, although you do find it amongst business people, Northern Ireland got the best of both worlds, economically as well, in terms of being able to trade unfettered north-south. Obviously, there are issues with goods going east-west. But the last point I'd make on this is that I wrote an article a year ago in a local unionist newspaper called The Newsletter, that Jenny, you might know, or others who know Northern Irish politics. And I was getting really irritated about how unionists here were claiming that if there is an economic or customs border between Northern Ireland and the rest of GB, that this is somehow some political constitutional crisis. My own view, this is nonsense. It is perfectly normal in particularly federal states where there will be economic differences. You may have had this experience, Jenny, that if you take your Northern Ireland pound note or £5 note and try and spend it in London, even though it's legal tender.
That is so true.
This may be the same with, Scottish people or people from Scotland. There we have, differences in economic arrangements and regulations between different parts of the UK. So the point I was making is that having a customs border down the Irish Sea does not undermine the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, even though, of course, it serves unionist political interests, because we have a politics based on fear in Northern Ireland. To make that jump from a customs border to making it into somehow this is the beginning of the end of Northern Ireland as part of the UK. But I can see there is another example of how dangerous Brexit has been in terms of the politics being played around this, because this is only going to enhance unionist people's fears of being sold out. There's already a fear of perfidious Albion, which is no stranger, of course, to you folk in Scotland. But even amongst unionists here, there's always this conditional loyalty to London, because they know they can't really completely trust London. So therefore, I find this argument of a customs border automatically being portrayed as undermining the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as part of the UK also very dangerous. It's almost like the symmetrical equivalent of what Irish Republicans are doing in terms of promoting a border poll. So you can see how we have the beginnings of the ingredients of a ratcheting up, certainly of political instability and tensions, which has not, thankfully, yet moved into violence, or indeed a return to the large-scale violence we've experienced here over the past, 40 years.
Yeah, so do you feel like, in society in general, there is a kind of heightened tension, or do you think that both sides are becoming hardened or more fearful?
We've had a hardening of attitudes and a hardening of the border as a result of a hard Brexit, if that isn't too many hards to have in one sentence. So certainly an already unstable and fragile peace might be too strong, but it's a frozen peace. I mean, people may not realise, but that Northern Ireland now has more people living in single identity housing than they did before 1998. We have more what's called peace walls in Northern Ireland. That's walls separating nationalists from unionists. We have more of these walls now than we had before the agreement. And it's kind of an odd thing to say, but it's almost like we've trusted each other enough as the two communities to agree to stop the violence and the all-out war, but we haven't developed trust enough to have a more normal, integrated society. I mean, just to give you an example, which might strike people who don't know Northern Ireland as very odd, my children have both been lucky enough, and Bernd would know this because it's quite a common schooling system in Germany. Both of my children have gone to the Steiner School here where I live in Hollywood, just outside Belfast. And that's part of the 5% integrated education system in Northern Ireland. In other words, 95% of children in Northern Ireland go to either state school, which is Protestant school, or Catholic maintained schools. So despite the fact that we have the agreement now coming up to over 20 years, we're still a very divided society. It's just that the violence is now leached out of the system, but the preconditions for violence are still there. And those preconditions are underlying sectarian tension, joblessness, growing inequality, a perception, particularly amongst loyalists or unionists, that all the gains are being made by Republicans and Irish nationalists, and that there is a narrative of decline within the unionist community. And that narrative of decline, I think, is the same one you found in Newcastle, in Sunderland, all those northern parts of England that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. They all share with Belfast, and particularly this unionist loyalist experience of deindustrialization, of being left behind, and so on. And that partly then explains why we did have a sectarian division in Northern Ireland over the referendum, where more people on the Protestant unionist loyalist side voted to leave than on the Catholic nationalist Republican side.
Yeah. It's scary times. Listen, I could talk all night. Definitely, we're running out of time. I'll just skip. I have a few questions here on trade, if that's all right. We'll just skip to them. So obviously, like you said, that Boris Johnson said over his dead body there will be like a border down the Irish Sea. But as we know, after the 31st of December, there will be a form of a border down the Irish Sea. And Northern Ireland will continue to follow the EU rules on agriculture and manufactured goods, while the rest of the UK will not. And additionally, the whole of the UK will leave the EU's customs union, but Northern Ireland will continue to enforce the EU's customs code at its ports. So how cumbersome do you think the paperwork will be? And do you think there will be, like lorry parks like in Kent and similar things like that? And do you think that companies have enough information?
Well, certainly, one of the other it's not unique to Northern Ireland, but maybe it's more exaggerated in terms of the structure of our regional economy. It's overwhelmingly made up of SMEs, small to medium enterprises, who simply don't have the capacity to deal with a lot of the paperwork online or other forms of the necessary bureaucracy, or particularly for East-West trade, which is where the major concern is, because the bulk of certain sectors of Northern Irish economy, particularly in terms of, say, agricultural, pharmaceuticals, is East-West. It's going from Northern Ireland into the GB market. So there are legitimate concerns there about what can happen. Of course, some businesses have decided, well, sod that for a game of soldiers. Let's go north-south. In other words, start looking for new markets if there's going to be too much bureaucracy going east-west. And certainly for me, it's because Northern Ireland is largely dependent on particularly agriculture, agri-foods, and tourism. Is another big concern in terms of how the impact of this is going to, play out in Northern Ireland. But in terms of, border posts and bureaucracy, a lot of the media were fixated on the border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic, and border posts being potential targets for Republican terrorists. Which leaves out the fact that we might probably more see loyalists and unionists protesting at ports and maybe airports around customs posts going east-west. And there has been some talk that what you might see on either side, either Republicans physically attacking customs posts on the Irish border or demonstrating outside of them, and likewise unionists at Belfast Port or Larne and so on, is something like a Gilets Jaunes movement that may erupt as soon as the reality of what looks like now a no-deal Brexit come the end of this year. So I think it's got all the recipe or all the ingredients for a lot of instability politically and economically. And my own experience is it's really only large companies that have the resources and the capacity to be able to, scenario out what they can do, to start looking for other markets and so on. But there's no doubt that on the one...
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, on the one hand, it could be a disastrous impact on certain sectors of the Northern Ireland economy. Others are saying that Northern Ireland got the best of both worlds in terms of being able to trade east-west and north-south in a way, say, for example, that Scotland or Wales can't. And I know there's been, grumblings from the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament about what seemed to be the preferential treatment for Northern Ireland. It's partly to do to assuage the concerns around the fragile peace process and the potential for a very, very bad no-deal Brexit, not just to be economically disastrous, but also then politically disastrous. And of course, we've only just had our local government restored here. For 3 years, the Northern Ireland Assembly didn't sit. It only was restored there in January. So it's still a very fragile administration. So in Northern Ireland, the real issues are not so much economic. It's how those economic issues can translate, often very quickly, into political crises.
Yeah. And you mentioned protesters there. What do you think like the aims and objectives of those protesters would be?
Well, that would be an interesting one to ask them, which I wouldn't be doing, and I wouldn't recommend anyone to go and ask. You could imagine that if it's Irish Republicans protesting outside border posts in Newry or Monaghan or Derry, it is about saying this is an example of British imperialism. It's artificially dividing Ireland. So it's a continuation of the old Republican and perfectly legitimate aspiration. Don't get me wrong. It's absolutely legitimate to aspire to a reunified Ireland. All I would say is make sure that it's non-violent. That's the main issue. On the other hand, if you're a loyalist or unionist protesting at Larne or Belfast Port over customs posts or checks by the EU of goods going east-west, well, obviously you're making your complaint really against Boris Johnson and the negotiators who have come to the decision that they have in terms of the customs border down the Irish Sea and so forth. So, it is, I would imagine on the loyalist side, it would be a protest against what they would see, to me, is an illegitimate or it's an erroneous perception, but the reality is your perception is your reality. It's this idea that, you translate a customs border into a constitutional crisis for Northern Ireland, that somehow this is the beginning of the end of Northern Ireland being part of the UK, just because we've got a different customs arrangement for Northern Irish goods than Scottish goods going to England would have, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, but we could talk all night. I have so many questions, but I suppose we should probably go to the audience and see if there's any questions, maybe on Twitter or Facebook.
So I have one question from Victoria Lee, which is essentially asking, why do you think that deindustrialized cities like Glasgow didn't go down the same routes as, say, the northeast of England did?
That's a very good question on that. To be honest with you, I don't really have a coherent answer. I'd love to see how, Liverpool voted, for example, or Birmingham or Preston, other working class cities that have, gone through a deindustrialization process. I would only have to think it has to do with maybe the increase in, even if you're not a Scottish Nationalist Party supporter, there's been a general increase in Scotland, certainly from my observation from afar, of a kind of civic nationalism. Again, it's not shared across all citizens in Scotland by any means. And it doesn't mean to say that you'll vote SNP, but that idea, which I thought very cleverly had been growing in Scotland for quite some time, similar to aspects of Irish politics, Republic of Ireland politics, that you could be Irish in Europe and you could be Scottish in Europe. I think that may have something to do with this. But again, I don't have the breakdown of the vote. So at this stage, I honestly don't know. But all I can hazard a guess at is that whether this idea of Scottish identity being connected in some way with being a member of the European Union may have acted as a buffer in a way that we saw didn't happen in Sunderland and Newcastle and so on.
Any more questions?
So just one follow-up really, which I think you sort of partly answered, which is thinking about the implications of Northern Ireland landing up with this kind of strange, almost privileged status by comparison to Scotland. And I just wondered, how you think that's likely to play out.
Well, I think on the one hand, this will probably be exploited politically, particularly in the new year, by Irish Republicans, maybe, or nationalists saying, well, actually, let's make the best of a bad lot and we can still press home with a United Ireland agenda. But in the meantime, encouraging businesses to, play both sides, east, west, north, south, being part in and part out of the European Union. And indeed, maybe even using that as a way of attracting in foreign investment in some way. I haven't really seen much public debate around that, but to me, that would seem to be an obvious way of exploiting this position Northern Ireland will have. I think to go back to a point I've made a few times now, I think unionists here, and particularly the DUP, are extremely short-sighted, that they don't want to present this as anything but a disaster. Yes, they want Brexit, but they didn't want this Brexit. But actually, they could equally make the same argument to say, well, actually, let's play the game here. Let's see if we can exploit both the GB market and membership of the United Kingdom and being members of the customs union of the EU. And I think that's where we'd have to shift our gaze away from political parties and actually look at what businesses are going to be doing. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, I'm not so close to figure out how businesses are going to react. I say, particularly around agri-food, pharmaceuticals, they're the big ones to watch out for because they're some of the main sectors of the economy here. We do have some small-scale engineering and so on. But for example, just to finish that point, we have a very successful bus building company. They built the Boris buses in London, Wrightbus they're called, based in Ballymena in North Antrim, or as we call it, the buckle of the Bible Belt in Northern Ireland. But that went through some difficulties last year. It was nearly going to go close. It was taken over by a very successful entrepreneur, Joe Bamford, who owns JCB, the big manufacturing company. And he has basically made the argument that he wants to see the bus building of Wrightbus is now going to pivot largely around hydrogen buses. And I'm involved, as other colleagues here at Queen's University, in some research around hydrogen in terms of my academic expertise, by the way, folks, is not in EU law or indeed even Northern Irish politics, although I've lived here and been an activist. My background is in some of the things Jenny was talking about, climate and low carbon energy transitions. And certainly his view is that the future it's a very large employer and a very large importer of capital and goods and services in the Northern Irish economy. He sees his future vision as an all-island hydrogen bus development, as well as then globally, selling hydrogen buses to other parts of the world and so on. Mm-hmm. So that might give you an example of how businesses are now pivoting to seeing how they can, again, make the best of a bad lot. And actually for some of them, they may have a silver lining that actually they're able to exploit membership of the United Kingdom and the GB market, which is very large, and also then membership of the Customs Union and obviously the millions of consumers in Ireland and other EU countries.
Yeah. I think it's just been absolutely fascinating. I'm really sorry, I think we've run out of time, but it's been fascinating. I had a ton more questions I was going to ask you, but thank you so much. Jenny. Yeah, we definitely will. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your views with us. And thank you to Paul, who's helping with social media. And thanks to Bernd as well. And thanks obviously to everyone who tuned in to listen. Bye now. Thanks.
Well, thank you all. And listen, it's been lovely talking to you. Some people bring joy wherever they go. Some whenever they go. So I'm going to leave.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.